This is Eric Johnson, the brand.
And Aaron Thigpen, the source.
Aaron, today's topic that we're going to discuss is what muscles do hitters need to develop to become good hitters?
Well, when I look at hitting, I look at what I call the hitter's kinetic chain. It's the flow of force through the body that manifests itself into a powerful swing, solid contact, and a good hit.
That's important. I think a lot of times when hitters come to me or, the parents call or another coach calls, says, I'm trying to get this guy's hand stronger. I'm trying to get him to have better bat speed. And the first thing they talk about is just their hands, and that's it. And I think that process or that thinking is a little bit different than how you and I may see things.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's more than that. And when I work with training hitters from an athletic standpoint and a physical development standpoint, what I'm looking at is to create an understanding of that kinetic chain and how force flows through the body.
I think that's important. I think a lot of times when I look at hitters and you and I talk and discuss about how this player is moving, and we always talk about, that kinetic chain and how it works, how it manifests into a becoming and developing a good, solid hitter.
Yeah. And when I instruct these hitters, what I do is I first draw a picture in their head, and I say, think of that force as being kind of like a tornado. If you look at a tornado, it's that rotative force of nature, but when you look at its shape or when you see it drawn, it's kind of like that funnel, and at the base you've got that small kind of spin, but it gets bigger and bigger and greater as it moves up. And if you're looking at that in terms of the body, you've got that base at the feet that slowly, that rotation gets bigger and bigger and manifests itself as a bigger action and more forceful action through the body.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. I think a lot of hitters forget that you're in the ground. Your feet are in the ground, and your force and the ground force that you have and how your feet are connected allows you to move correctly initially.
Right.
And I think that's overlooked a lot. I think players need to understand that their feet are super, super important.
Right, and that's why when we work with them, I talk about, having strong feet, having stable feet. So I work with athletes in doing foot strengthening exercises and creating an awareness of where they are on their feet in terms of, are they on the heels or on the inside of their foot or on the outside of the foot? Are they on the ball of their foot? Generally in sports, you can't do most athletic movements without the big toe being in contact with the ground. So I always really require that the athlete know what their big toe is doing, because the foot will follow what the action of that big toe is. So that creating that awareness, I think, is important when you're talking about starting that kinetic chain of an athlete's swing.
Yeah, I see a lot of times when athletes start to swing, I see their hands go first or their shoulders go first. Mm-hmm. And I immediately think that, oh man, this athlete's sequencing pattern's off.
Right.
And maybe they don't have that awareness of what their feet are doing, and they're just standing there and they have no awareness of how strong they can be with their lower body.
Right. And so in staying with this theme of the kinetic chain and following force up through the body, again, we first talk about the feet and the base. Now we want to move up to the thighs, okay? And again, that you can call that maybe a thigh complex, because you're talking about not just your quads, but you're talking about the inner thigh and the outer thigh. So that's actually some partial hamstrings and other muscular actions going on in there. And even though it may not look like it, those actually rotate, and they're involved in transferring that force in generating some of the first rotational aspects of the body. So having that muscle group working well and being strong is important. what happens is a lot of athletes, just because of the lifestyle that they lead outside of sports, with a lot of sitting, and, you know, in the classroom or on the computer at home, they become quad dominant. And so some of those, especially the inner thigh muscles, aren't as strong as they need to be. And those outer thigh muscles, or maybe even the IT bands, become tight. And so you've got weak inner thigh, tight outer thigh. You can't really generate the force that you need with those muscles in an athlete if those aren't developed.
So do you think a lot of times these athletes, in terms of flexibility in those areas, are inhibited? Because if they're not flexible, they're also, then that, I feel that can hurt their ability to use those muscles correctly.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, one of the big things is tight IT band syndrome with a lot of athletes, and so that generally will manifest itself as knee pain, or maybe some pronation or supination with the knee in the wrong direction, because it maybe can only move, has limited range of motion. All of that affects how that force is going to come up through the body. So if you have a guy who's swinging back and maybe his knee doesn't rotate as well as it should, or there's buckling, or those sorts of things, well, those can be attributed some part to the strength of the inner and outer thigh, and whether there are imbalances or whether there are restrictions on range of motion, flexibility, all of that affects that kinetic chain and the force coming through that kinetic chain.
That makes a lot of sense, because, you know, I see players' knees buckle a lot, or when they try to pivot or rotate at the correct time, there's no stability there. You know, the flexibility there is not there, or they buckle,
or they can't get around.
Yeah, they can't rotate enough. You know, when they need to rotate. So I like the way you broke that down there.
So again, following our kinetic chain up through the body, our feet, then our thigh, quad complex, whatever you'd like to call that. Then we're going to what I call our primary power movers, which is the glutes and the hips. And again, I don't necessarily separate those things. I like to call them complexes, because all of these things are moving together, and you want a synergy of all of these muscles working together to produce the optimal swing. So when we're talking about the glute and hip complex, we're talking about strong, powerful glutes. They don't just have to be big, but they got to be strong. And we want range of motion in the hips. We want those hips to be able to rotate on the proper axis and complete the range of motion and not be inhibited. And it's kind of, if you're thinking of maybe twisting something, you've got one hand that's pulling and the other is pushing.
Gotcha.
That, you know, so that's the glutes and the hips working together.
Right.
There's some contraction, there's some extension, and that's what again helps that force travel through the kinetic chain up the body into the torso and the other parts of the athlete.
I've heard you mention this before, Aaron, about that athlete that's pound for pound strong, and they're wiry strong.
Yeah.
And they're like kind of like that tree branch that you explained to me one day we were talking about hitting. Right. Can you kind of go over that again? Yeah. That's such a good point.
Yeah, I like to, you know, see athletes that I call skinny strong. And what I mean by that is, I mean, you don't necessarily have to have the size and the bulk, especially in sports that aren't contact related. You just need to be strong. And I like to see my athletes strong and pliable. And that's why I kind of use the analogy of that willow branch, where you're trying to, you know, if you've ever tried to snap a branch off of a willow,
right.
You can't. I mean, it's strong, it's pliable, but it bends and it moves, and it doesn't break. And that's the type of athlete I'm looking for. I'm looking for an athlete who is grounded, who is strong, who is pliable, but that snaps back.
Right.
That's the sort of characteristics I'm looking to develop in their muscles and their tendons and ligaments and that sort of thing.
That's so important. the ground force and the way you explain how the feet and how it moves all the way up to the knee and the thighs and the hips and that glute complex you talk about, and how that needs to be really strong for a hitter to develop.
That's correct. I think that's so important. And just also having that ability to use the body in that way is just so much of it's more efficient. Mm-hmm. and it doesn't take as much energy. And I look at the Latin athletes and how they're rhythmic, and not just the Latin athletes but the other athletes. You see that they have kind of a rhythm and a coordination to the things that they do. And even though it may not look textbook, they seem to always get there at the right time. And I like that they have that internal timing and that pliability and that again, that rhythmic coordination that allows them to be successful.
It's not a static athlete. It's a rhythmic athlete. It's, as they say in the baseball, it has a little flavor. He has a little flair to it, right? Exactly. A little flair there. And that athlete can move efficiently. And I see so many static hitters now. It's just like, okay, A, B, C, work. And you want your athlete to be an athlete as a hitter. This is an athletic move, right?
Right.
So we can't be robotic. We need to be athletic. And I think you couldn't have said that any better. That athlete needs to move with a rhythm.
Right. And it's the same thing in sprinting. Again, I draw a lot of my parallels in some of these other sports to some of the sprinting activity. If you don't have the rhythm and coordination that's required, you're not going to maximize the effort. And that's really what you're talking about, is you want to maximize that swing. You want to maximize the effort in that swing, and it should come out effortlessly. And, that's why it looks easy on TV, and people think they can do it.
Right.
Well, it's because these guys have mastered it and they're professionals, and that's why it looks easy. If it looks hard, you're probably not doing it right.
Right. And I think that's important. I think having a process of understanding how the swing works from the ground up is critical for players, for parents to understand how to train a hitter. It starts there.
Right. And so after we move on from the feet and the thigh complex and the glutes and hips, then I look at the core complex. And again, when I'm seeing core, I'm not just talking about abs. I'm talking about your obliques, your erectors, all of those muscles that work together, again, work together synergistically to produce the force that you're looking for. So I'm talking about forward flexion, backward flexion, flexion, rotation, flexion on different angles, sagitudinal, all of those sorts of things that allow the forces in the body to continue to flow, but also being strong enough for that they don't get out of control, so that you don't get off balance. In other words, sometimes they call it anti-rotation.
Okay.
Or decelerative properties in the core are just as important as the accelerative properties in the core. Most people work on the accelerative properties, but those decelerative properties are actually what's going to keep, I think, an athlete consistent with his swing, and also once they find the right plane, the swing plane, keeping them on plane on that path.
That leads me into this next thing, Aaron, is that when the ball starts to move, the height starts to go higher, lower, middle, or outside, inside, you have to adjust on those planes. And if your body is not conditioned to move that way, then it's hard for you to hit. So what you just mentioned there is so critical on the height of the pitch, the location of the pitch, or how fast it's coming. You have to be able to adjust. And if those muscles aren't strong, it will be harder to hit those pitches.
So moving from our core complex, now our force is moving up to the shoulders. And I call the shoulders a secondary power generator. I call the glutes and the hips kind of our first or our primary power movers. But the shoulders are also stabilizers. And again, it's one of those major points in the body that if you're not strong, solid, have the decelerative properties to control the force, it's a point where it can dissipate and get away from you. And so I think strong shoulders are important. Again, you've got accelerative and decelerative properties of your muscles, and you want both of those aspects developed in your shoulders.
So basically, those are working kind of like levers,
Right.
basically. And those shoulders stabilizing the swing allows you to have proper extension. And I think that's important because a lot of times people think it's just a hands, shoulders, arm swing. And if that sequencing is off, then it looks like the plane's going to be off, the back gets out of position, and then now it becomes highly athletic just to make contact. And that's when you get guys mishitting the baseball or swinging and missing, is because they're using those stabilizers too early in their swing and they're not following that kinetic chain that you and I've talked about a lot.
Right. And as the force goes from the shoulders, then we're talking about the head. In my aspect, the head. And the reason why I think this is important and needs to be touched on is that the head acts as the rudder or the guidance for the body. Basically, in sports, your head is going to dictate the even the big shifts or minor shifts in your body movement. It's just that simple. And maybe to go even deeper, you're talking about your vision, because your head is always going to follow where your eyes go. So I think a hitting athlete, needs to be aware of what position their head is in as it goes through your swing path and swing activity, because that can then pull you out of position just by pulling your eyes up and out, or maybe looking down to the ground. Maybe a lot of different things can happen on your swing if you don't have that guidance system locked into what you're going to do.
I think that's crucial. I think your eyes and your head have to be perfectly level when you're going to swing. They can't be moving a lot or bobbing up and down, because it is going to take your body into a way different position when you go to strike the baseball. So if you can keep your eyes stable, keep your head stable, great. You mentioned something I think is really important, your vision. People never talk about the vision hitting the baseball, and those muscles need to develop also. And there are exercises that you can do to develop those muscles, as you do in your sports performance training all the time. I see you, as we work with hitters together, I see us talking a lot about vision and developing those muscles.
Right. And here's something to think about. Again, I'm a sprinter, so a lot of my parallels or analogies are back to sprinting. But I think, one thing you can look at in sprinting, and we have to teach our sprinters this, is not to look up and down. Mm-hmm. Because when you look up and down, there's always a deceleration when you do that.
Right.
And athletes don't understand that, is if you look to the side when you're racing somebody, that will slow you down for a split second. If you look down, that will slow you down for a split second. So there's a connection there between your vision and your head and what it will do to your body in relation to the force that you're trying to generate. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important that athletes, again, be consistent with, first, I guess, know where their head should be on their swing plane.
Right.
What are some focal points or some key points that they should be considering for their vision and their eyes, right, in terms of tracking, and how all of that comes together, so that way they can be consistent. Because I think if you're consistent there, that will also help you be consistent in some other aspects of your swing in terms of staying on your swing plane.
I like that. I mean, it makes perfect sense of what we're trying to develop in a hitter.
So as we move through our force curve here, our flow, then we're talking about arms after we're talking about the head there. And the arms are the levers of force. That's the way I look at it.
Okay, gotcha.
I'm not looking at, hey, what can you bench press or what can you curl. I'm not looking at, if the guy has guns or not. I'm looking at those levers. And that's where they're that skinny strong, that pliability, that range of motion, the able to stabilize those levers and transfer that force that's going to go to the hands and then through the bat at impact.
Yeah, those levers are important. They help us with extension, and I think if your levers are off, then extension is off, and you